of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. This is our agenda for today. So we'll just have a quick safety moment, and then Werner and Pim will get into their presentation. And then afterwards we'll have a short Q&A. It'll just be a short session today, 30 minutes approximately. We've still got plenty of time. Safety moment. This is basically just me telling a story of coming in today and going into the office for the first time since we've come out of lockdown. And basically the process is, as you probably know, but just in case you've forgotten, book a desk using Space IQ, check in before arriving, go to level 6, check in at the reception using the Service New South Wales app, and also show your proof of vaccination to reception if this is your first time back. Then you can head to level 8 to collect your box or boxes and drop them on level 5 in one of the alcoves, which will be replaced by lockers sometime in the future. Thanks to Cameron for this little map that he's prepared of where people's boxes are on level 8, because there are boxes everywhere and it can be hard to work out where they are. And just as a note, you'll need to check in with the reception each time you re-enter the office. So if you go out for lunch and come back, you have to check in again, but they'll have your vaccination status recorded after your first time. So at least you don't have to show that again. And for some reason, we still have Cecile's box and a few other people I know who aren't necessarily in the office very often. So I hope they don't have anything perishable in those boxes. So now we'll switch over to Werner and Pim. Are you guys ready to share your screen? Hopefully it goes smoother than my attempt did. I think you guys are still on mute as well. Oh, there
Can you guys hear me and see the slides?
Yes, we can hear you and see the slides now.
Beautiful. Kia ora koutou tēnā koutou ko Vanera ho. Greetings to those across the ditch, and always delighted to share knowledge and learnings from projects here from New Zealand. Today our talk is about transit accessibility and land use and transport interactions. Myself and Pim will be presented, who's largely been working on the project, and also some of our colleagues who's not joining us today. The bulk of the presentation would be centered around Auckland Transit Study, which is a project we've been working on for quite a couple of months now. And before we do that, Pim probably just provide us with some context about Auckland to give everybody a kind of a flavor for where Auckland has moved in the past couple of decades, and also the policy environment. And then lastly, I'll just give you an indication of the next steps of our study and potential collaborations where we might work together in future if someone wants to adopt something similar, or your clients is interested in similar work. So probably just hand over to Pim now to do the Auckland context. Pim, just give me a shout if you want me to move the slides.
Cool, thanks, Werner. Yeah, I thought I'd just start us off with a very quick, brief overview of sort of the context in which we're working. I know a lot of you are in Australia, yeah, this is our current rapid transit network. I say rapid in air quotes because a lot of it doesn't fulfill the sort of traditional definitions of rapid transit, but they do generally have their own rights of way, and they're reasonably frequent. And this is the station. These are the stations that we worked on for this particular project. So there's 40 rail stations, 12 ferry stations, and 6 busway stations. Just next slide. So historically, as I'm sure that is the same with many Australian cities, Auckland is traditionally car dominated. PT has had historically low levels of investment, and almost all of Auckland's growth has been accommodated with sprawl and sort of suburban expansion. But there's a sort of a growing recognition that these issues, that these approaches create a lot of issues. there are a lot of concerns around climate now, especially, but there's also health issues, and it's also very expensive to expand in this way. So there has been a gradual shift in approach, and that shift has accelerated in the last few years. Just next slide. So here you can kind of see this in action where, you know, in the 60s, we invested a lot in vehicle infrastructure and expanded the city quite significantly. You can see there, it might be a little small, but you can see that the rail network from the 60s to now is largely unchanged, but the motorway network has been expanded quite drastically, and so is the urban extent. Just next slide. So this policy direction is shifting though. We've seen a lot more investment in public transport since sort of the early 2000s. There's a bit of a shift there, and that has sort of accelerated. There's now also an increased focus on no longer expanding out past our current urban limits. And some of the most pertinent recent developments, the first one is up the top there, National Policy Statement for Urban Development, which is a directive that came from the government to require councils to allow for at least 6 stories within walkable catchments of transit stations. And that, of course, has a massive impact there, but there's also the removal of minimum parking requirements. The most recent government policy statement for transport has focus on travel choice, climate change and safety. Those themes are repeated in the Regional Land Transport Plan in Auckland, which again, climate, travel choice, access, safety and similar. And a plan which is new, which we haven't had before, which is currently under development, is the Auckland Rapid Transit Plan. And the work we're going to talk about today is part of its purpose is to feed into the development of that. Next slide. So this is a bit more detail. When we send the slides out after this, you can have a bit more, a bit of a closer look at this. But essentially, the key tenets of the National Policy Statement for Urban Development is an increase in density around rapid transit stations and sort of larger centres within the urban area, removal of parking requirements, and other sort of related changes. Next slide. And GPS on land transport in New Zealand, very strong focus on safety, access, the environment, travel choice, and the like. This is quite a shift from recent government policy statements, which have often focused on efficiency, throughput, heavier focus on the economics of moving freight and the like. These are all obviously still important, but these have sort of been superseded by these concepts around safety and the environment. Next slide. So to sort of sum up, there's been 2 key shifts in focus, and that's a shift from cars and roads to public transport and active modes, and a shift from sprawl and suburbia to higher densities and transit-oriented development. But these sort of have almost been treated as 2 disciplines for a very long time, in the transport space and in the sort of land use planning or urban planning space. And in the past, they haven't always played nicely together. There hasn't always been a good level of integration or a good level of communication between these 2 disciplines. And with these shifts in focus, there's sort of a need to change that. So next slide. So we need new tools. We need better tools to be able to understand the issues in a more integrated way. And that's kind of what the work that we've done is all about. And I'm going to hand over to Ernest to sort of introduce the work that we're doing.
Thanks, Pam. Probably just Alex or Pam, just give me a shout if there's any sound issues. Then I can disconnect my earphones. So the next part of the session is the kind of mechanics of our study that we've undertaken, and as Pam indicated, the key objective for us is to start understand the science around the stations and the key stakeholders in a better way than what we've done before. And some of the key objectives was to kind of improve the access to and from the stations, but including both the transport access and the land use access component. And in addition to that, also understanding the deficiencies at each of the stations. But also importantly, the second step is, once we know those deficiencies, is understanding the gaps and the problems, is addressing those deficiencies with an investment plan of how to make them more accessible, and also bring all the stakeholders along in that decision making. So these are all the stations, as Pim indicated, that we looked at. The kind of focus area for our studies was not only the station and the station footprint, but also the surrounding catchments, which for consistency, we've used the 800-meter cookie cutter catchment surrounding each of those transit hubs, and looking at both the kind of key transport and land use components. And we moved into a space where we had discussions about what is important to be measured or looked at around stations. And whenever you do that, there's always a lot of discussion about definitions about transit-orientated development, but by and large, with a lot of subjectivity, and also, and to a large extent, gets you down a rabbit hole of disagreeing about definitions. But then we moved to a space to say, hey, what is the key outcomes that we would like to advance around the stations, and how could we potentially measure those outcomes? And we've looked into all the access means of how the station is accessed. We've explored customer experience, urban design, which is kind of what we're focusing on the next phase somewhat. We've looked into land use metrics around how station orientated the density, the development is, the density, the diversity of the land, and also kind of unpacking somehow how the public and private interactions might work together with the data that we've put together. But even with combining all the data, there's this traditional problem how our planning system has been quite fragmented in how the decisions has been made. And in order to shift or make this leap of being more integrated, there's a general change in direction or change in focus where we need to be more joined up in our thinking if we want to be double dipping or triple dipping around our investment, and making sure it doesn't necessarily only meet the individual discipline, but also have the wider benefits for multiple disciplines. So context for why we opted for this kind of approach: a while ago, I did a review of international decision support tools around transit hubs, both exploring academic and professional circles around the world, and ended up with the study in the Netherlands being quite attractive in terms of how it's gone about doing the kind of assessments around the stations quite efficiently and bringing along quite a extensive amount of stakeholders. It's called Marktplatz, which is effectively also referred to as the butterfly policy tool, which is a decision support tool that brings a qualitative approach to movement place analytics around stations, and puts them in a consistent framework so many key stakeholders can work together. And I think one of the reasons why it was so challenging or not that transparent that this tool has been available is because the bulk of the Dutch documentation is in Dutch, and because of that reason, it means that a lot of the work that kind of to actually learn about this requires quite a lot of exploring with Google Translate and figuring out what some of it says. Effectively, what they did is they brought all the kind of key players around the stations and decision makers, and they went on a journey about 2 to 3 years of working out what the best way might be is working better together. And they ended up developing something, as I referred to as the butterfly model, which was effectively, as I said, a quantitative assessment tool of movement in place around transit nodes. And they, on the left-hand side, they have slow-moving traffic, which is effectively active modes, public transport, and roads. And this is a radar diagram as to how they evaluate how good it's performing. And on the right-hand side, they have proximity, which is how close is the development to the station, the overall density around the catchment, and how diverse the land use activities is surrounding the catchment. other interesting thing that they also did that we found quite useful is they developed a classification system based on the butterflies, and identify, similar to what you'll see in a road classification system, you'll have the A roads, the B roads, and the motorways classified in a certain way, and that kind of gives you a general direction as to when it's in this location and it has this classification, it should look like that. So they also classified or developed this classification system and also classified what the future should look like for each of those stations, which was quite interesting. But I'll probably give you just a rapid fire overview of how they've started with the kind of general intent of their study, and then show you how we've applied it. So use the station as a focal point in the surrounding catchment, identify the station typology that it belongs to, and you could see at the back here, like a shaded gray, is effectively the station typology shown. And then secondly, they quantify the existing conditions, which is the slightly lighter version shown there. And then this is kind of where you visualize those outcomes when you can make integrated decisions together. And this is where you plan your investment for the future. And this kind of gives you an indication, if you haven't been to Amsterdam in the past 5 years, this changes additional 10,000 parking provisions that they've already implemented, which is already reaching capacity at this stage. And they've kind of interpreting this as the density around the station is very good. The public transport access is very good. The development is not very station orientated. That's why this is scoring low, because of the adjacent water constraints. And the diversity of the land is quite diverse and multiple uses. The car orientatedness of the station is very low, and they're even trying to make it lower by banning more car parks in the future. And that's the basic mechanics of how it works. They've also done the same thing for all the stations in the Netherlands, and they've also expanded it for uses for a corridor level, where typically you have operations and corridor investments happening alongside key corridors, so it makes it better to understand the deficiencies alongside those investments, and also use it more strategically as a growth enabler for planning future growth areas, making sure that it's placed in an area where the land could be better utilized. So that's kind of where we started as a base in terms of our research for our study. And we started with effectively that slides that I've just shown you there, and established a working group with Auckland Transport, Auckland Council, and Waka Kotahi, who is the National Transport Agency, and took along all the key subject matter experts in their field, and to precisely define the process in a way that is more unique for New Zealand context. And what we've effectively adopted is started with the base of the butterfly, but also adapted it quite significantly for New Zealand context. And the key area where we'd made a significant enhancement is in the walking and cycling, because in the Netherlands context, they didn't necessarily have the same quality of or same deficiencies as we have in Auckland. And most of the metrics that they deemed was not necessary to measure. We had severe deficiencies, and there was quite clear direction from our clients that they wanted to separate those, given that their organizations and their subject matter experts is also separated in that way. But ultimately, this is what we ended up producing as an adapted model, using the mechanics of the butterfly, but also significantly adapted it for using Auckland data. We started off with developing principles, and from that principles, we created metrics, and for each of the walking, cycling, public transport, car access, and all the land use functions, we have precise metrics around footpaths, connectivity, walking catchment, safety, cycling connections, parking, how it's connected, general safety, and a number of public transport access measures. It's the same for car. These are the ones I've explained, which is quite similar to the Dutch proximity, density, and diversity. But the key one with transport and land use and integration around stations is making sure that the level of density and development is reflective or equal to the level of public transport access. And the key use case for the public transport access and density is seeking balance between the two. If the density is higher, there's a desire to increase the public transport access and services, and likewise the opposite. If the density is low, you effectively want the opposite. And this is what we ended up with the key metrics, and each of these wedges has effectively become a key summarized score of that assessment. We started off with, as I said, with all this data from different sources. We translated that into information or geospatial information that subject matter experts can actually interpret. And we've summarized it in a way similar to the Dutch, with slightly, I hope, better representation of how each of those scores, gave them detailed explanations on how to interpret the information and what it means. Also, the land use information around the zoning and how you can influence and shape that from a land use perspective. And then ultimately, similar to the Dutch, we had produced this integrated place where this kind of integrated decision making can actually happen, and the range of decision or subject matter experts can sit around the table and look at the same consistent set of information and decide on a potential future route for investment. And to give you a context, this is one of our biggest stations in Auckland, Britomart, and to give you a breakdown of what our recommendation would be in terms of what to do based on this assessment is effectively, on the walking side, there's a number of safety issues that we've discovered around the stations, although the general quality is quite good. There's one crossing immediately adjacent to the station that is not safe or not fit for purpose and should be fixed. The walking or the cycling connections and the cycling parking could significantly be improved, and also likewise the safety. There is existing investment in rail happening with CRL, so this line that you see here would be increasing as a result. But also there's for the central station in Auckland, there's no intercity rail, which might likely be planned for future. From the car orientatedness, there's no park and ride, public park and ride, but there's quite a significant amount of private parking. But the general policy direction for that area is to reduce parking supply in the centre city and move to based on the city centre master plan. And the proximity is good enough given the context. It's immediately adjacent to station, but there's also good density immediately adjacent to the station. Density is the best in the entire network, but diversity, it is diverse in terms of the activities and things you can access from a recreational or from an activity perspective. But this measure is the balance between commercial and residential, and it's highly commercial, which leads to a need for potentially getting more houses close to that employment areas, which will benefit both VKT and produce vehicle kilometers traveled reductions. This is another example of a station which is at the edge of the network, to give you the other extreme of Britomart, and it's basically a station called Albany, which is at in the North Shore, kind of at the top of Auckland's urban edge, which is a station which is very car orientated, with quite a significant amount of both public and private parking supply. And if we were to go into a bit more detail of how this still could be used in a station like this, is we also, in addition to that, we produce a second page which gives you a breakdown of what all that data means. And this one you could see where the areas of higher and lower density areas are. This one gives you indication on how, if it's more commercial or more residential, and areas which is more balanced or mixed use. But you can clearly see that this area could have a better balance by adding more residential components to this area. Likewise, the opposite in this one. But on the transport access side, you have the walking network, and this red lines indicate where the existing footpath is deficient based on the delta between the TDM standards, which is our design standards, versus reality, where the quality of those footpaths can be improved. This kind of shaded green areas, the walking catchment from the station. And what you can see here is that the entire kind of left-hand quadrant has good, decent connections, but the entire right-hand side have very poor connectivity. So it kind of leads you to a space where you could actually improve the connection here somehow, because this entire center is where the motorway is created quite a lot of severance. On the cycling side, there's also not a significant amount of parking at the station, but the quality of the cycling network immediately adjacent or connecting the station is quite poor and quite hostile. So there's also a very good opportunity to improve the active mode access there, and the kind of, if the lines is not green, it basically means it's deficient, and what you can see is also either not present or severely deficient. Public transport access, we probably not too much to talk about there, but there's some minor improvements that could be made on the car access levels. The car access levels is very good. They have a motorway, they have a major route east-west and north-south, and good access, and quite a significant amount of private and public parking opportunities there. And one of the things that you could use this for is saying, currently, for example, this station is operating at capacity in terms of its day-to-day park and ride facilities. But actually, if you wanted this station to be more sustainable, you should rather focus on improving the metrics in the active mode facilities, and that actually might relieve some of your supply issues in your stations as well, and also in turn have benefits for climate. And we did the similar thing that the Dutch did in analyzing all of these stations in great detail, and we have a very detailed report where all of this examples that I've shown you, for one or two examples for every single station within the network. If you just click, we'll share the slides afterwards, but click on that link and then you'll get access to the report. And this section, probably Pam, you can provide some input around the high-level findings that we got from the study.
Yeah, sure. I'm a little conscious of time. We are now at I think 5 o'clock for you guys, so I'll try and be very brief on this. But just to give you some sort of highlights, we found that the density across the most of the stations in the network, the land use density was very low, in almost every station that wasn't in the middle of the city, which is not unexpected, but the scale to which that was the case was quite interesting. The quality of cycling towards the stations is very poor, and almost everywhere. But I think one of the key parts, and you'll see a bit clearer in the next couple of slides, is that PT access is decent in a lot of places, but the density isn't necessarily matching that level of public transport accessibility. So we'll just snip over to the next slide. Here you can kind of see geographically mapped. So for context, do you want to just hover over the middle of the city for those who don't know Auckland that well? So the centre of the city is around there. Britomart is the one close to, up the top there, close to the harbour. That's where our biggest station is. So you can kind of see that the walking quality is decent in the inner suburbs, but gets quite poor the further out you get. Cycling access is quite poor almost everywhere, and in the circumstances where it's good, that's generally due to a lot of cycle parking rather than other cycling infrastructure like cycle lanes and the like. So next slide. Yeah, again, PT, you can see the ferry terminals score pretty low. Ferry frequencies are decently low, and the level of connectivity you get out of it is nowhere near as good as other rapid transit routes. Density is the big one, and the space where you can probably you could probably improve that quite a lot with better land use planning. In the centre city, high density, everywhere else, very, very low. Next slide. So the one on the left here is quite interesting. You can kind of see where the public transport and levels of public transport and the land use density are out of balance. The big one that jumped out to us was on the North Shore. There's a busway that runs up there, and it has very high frequency, especially at peak, good service levels, but the density around the stations is very, very low, especially compared to its public transport. Some of the ferry terminals look like they're in balance, but that's mainly due to having both low PT and low density levels. So yeah, just when you're something to bear in mind. Yeah, I think the car one, again, you can see along the North Shore, it's a newer development. If you go back to the earlier slide, you can see that that's more recent, right next to the motorway. It's a busway constructed along the motorway, so high levels of car accessibility there. Yeah, and I'll pass back to Werner to talk about the next steps.
Yeah, so I think this is probably will be the last slide, and largely just giving you context around the wider program of work that we've been undertaking. So what we've done to date is we've established best practice principles and outcomes. We've measured those consistently across all the stations. We've established the baseline, and in the process, we still want to refine some metrics in measuring customer experience and other elements. And the typology and measuring future stations is a part of the next stage. We'll include committed investments that's currently planned for the next investment run. In addition to that, we'll also identify the deficiencies that's still remaining after that investment. And then also, it's kind of still once that is complete, this is intended to be used to continuously measure progress as and when investment happened every couple of years. Also, it should be used as a tool to enable good land use planning and enabling good growth. And there could also be a master planning component to this, which we are not providing, but we're inviting kind of additional master planning to be undertaken with understanding the data that we've provided. That's in short our session. Happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thanks very much, Werner and Pim, for the presentation. Sorry, I'm just using a different laptop at the moment. Hello. There we go. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, could you please jump in? I also have one or two of my own questions. With the Marktplatz system and the butterfly, which sort of seems to like the ideal shape is that those two diamonds, and the sort of metropolitan city has strong car use and public transport and bicycle. But I think you did also mention that the Dutch at various stations were trying to push down that that car quality or level of service, I guess. So it's just, did they comment much on how their sort of ideal shape is actually partially in conflict with itself, I guess, in terms of spatial? Yeah.
Yeah, I think
you go, Werner.
More generally, I think the policies at the time that they've implemented it was effectively in 2014, so it's quite some time ago. And secondly, it's intended to be designed spatially so it fits the context, which if it's city centre or on the edges, and also the land use typology.
I think just to add on to that, like having a score of 100 isn't necessarily good. It's context dependent. So the idea is you set a typology for a given station or a given type of station, and you strive for that typology, whether that means increases or decreases in any of the metrics. But I think the general policy environment, especially in our context, is that the car metric in most cases should at most stay static. It has to come down. Walking and cycling should go up, density should go up, etc. So it's sort of context and policy dependent essentially, and 100 is not necessarily good.
Great, thanks. There's also been a few comments in the room just about the quality of the graphics that we used for this presentation and for the report. Was there any sort of special software that you used or sort of any automation of the data visualization that went into that?
You could get me talking for another hour on that, to be honest. So we launched for the visualizations of everything. I used a combination of Illustrator and InDesign, and used JavaScripting to create the graphics. So we did all the maths in Excel and in GIS, pulled them into spreadsheets, and then pulled the spreadsheets into Illustrator and InDesign. It was a little bit, because the first time we're doing it, it was a little bit janky, but it ended up working quite well. And yeah, that's kind of how we did it.
Wow. Yeah, it sounds quite.
I remember a time when we did some calculations on how many pieces of metrics needs to be presented, and we ended up realizing that if it's not automated, it's just not going to work. And we didn't really know if it would be possible or if it would work. We had some examples of it might work, and then we managed to figure out that it could work, and we could reproduce that anywhere now.
Yeah, well, it definitely seems to have paid off, at least from some of the comments in here. If there aren't any more questions,
I got one.
There we go.
Hey guys,
Yeah,
how you going? Great presentation, looks really good. Really interesting piece of work. Kind of interested just to sort of maybe get your perspective as part of maybe on the next steps. Obviously there's City Rail Link that's coming along, but with the refocusing of development around stations, maybe just sort of understanding if you're looking potentially at population and employment projections in the future to maybe rehash some of the assessment so that you can potentially see where investment should be better made for stations depending on priorities around urban infill.
Yeah, I think there's quite a number of interactions actually, because there's the land use change interaction where we have consented data knowing things will happen, but also having this more of a strategic focus around investment around these stations and enabling that growth to happen quicker or be make it easier for developers to develop in those areas is also one area of focus. This study is also used as another layer wherever development is happening and throughout the consenting process, and there's a deficiency that we've identified that's not being invested. For example, if there's a big development adjacent to one of the deficiencies, we could make it the development contribution to fix some of those deficiencies as well. So the kind of layers and layers of how this could be used is quite significant. Investment prioritization within the transport agency, the land use agencies, development consenting processes, and also kind of more national growth. For example, in many instances in New Zealand, the government own quite a lot of land around some of these stations, and some of them is quite significant. So that's areas where they can directly influence it. The outcomes without any barriers, i.e. there's still cost money, of course, but the second part is where they don't own the land and they need private initiatives to enable that. They can make it easier, and from the transport and land use policy context, it's an easy, given the context that PIM provided, all the barriers in terms of restrictions has been entirely removed in the past couple of years. So there's really the environment for that type of enablement is there now.
And I think just to add to that, I think one of the other key sort of uses for this is we can sort of say in X number of years, this is one of the next steps. In X number of years, the station will look approximately like this. And you can either look at it from the perspective of these policy changes enable approximately this growth, so therefore you probably need to boost the PT levels to support that, and vice versa. You can say something like the PT levels here are very good, but the density is very low, so if you want to enable additional density somewhere, maybe this is the first place you should look. It is more indicative rather than this is exactly how much density this can exactly support, but it does give you a really good indication, and that's kind of the idea behind one of the ideas behind the tool.
Yeah, nice. Look forward to seeing it unfold.
Great. Any other last questions? No? Well, in that case, I'd just like everyone to give a big round of applause and thanks to our guest presenters today. Virtual applause as well if you're not in this room. Thanks a lot, Pim and Werner. That was very interesting. And yeah, thanks everyone for attending this Tech Talks. We also have a farewell online thing happening after this or about now. So for those who want to join on that, just switch over to the different meeting. But yes, thanks everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.
Have a good weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.